mention it. So, yeah, of course. Good evening. I am Art Vandenhouten. I am the Dean of the Faculty at Flagler College, and I am delighted to welcome you tonight. Thank you so much for coming out. It's a special privilege to introduce our guest speaker, Jodi Enda, an acclaimed journalist and innovative leader who's the Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Correspondent for the Fuller Project, where she focuses on the effects of U.S. policies and politics on women in America and around the world. Jodi's covered government and politics at every level, from City Hall to the State House to the White House, presidential campaigns. Throughout her career, she's paid particular attention to women's rights, challenges, and their emerging power, with special emphases on the battle over abortion rights and the influence of female voters. Prior to joining the Fuller Project, Jodi served as editor-in-chief of Think Progress. She spearheaded CNN's 2016 election book, Unprecedented, the election that changed everything. She covered the White House, Congress, presidential campaigns, national news for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Knight Ridder newspapers. Jodi started her career covering public housing for the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, education and City Hall for the Rocky Mountain News. Her work has been published in numerous outlets, including Vanity Fair, USA Today, CNN.com, NBCNews.com, American Journalism Review, American Prospect, and just yesterday, The New Republic. Jodi's won awards for investigative reporting, deadline reporting, White House coverage, and media coverage, including the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award, the White House Correspondents Association Merriman Smith Award twice, the John M. Higgins Award for Best In-Depth Enterprise reporting on the media industry, and the most prestigious Syracuse University's Mirror Awards. She is former president of the Journalism and Women's Symposium, which advocates for the empowerment of women in journalism and for inclusive coverage in the media, is a former member of the White House Correspondents Association Board of Directors. She also teaches a political journalism course at Cornell University's Washington program. Tonight, however, she is with us in St. Augustine. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Leonard's Photography and Casa Monica Hotel. And we want to thank you especially for being with us tonight. Know that we'll welcome your questions at the end of public address. And now let's give Jodi Enda a warm St. Augustine welcome. Jodi.
Well, thank you for that welcome. I hope that you're not all bored already by hearing all of that. My background tells you just a little bit about how old I am, right? So, been around for a long time, and I want to thank you for providing this warm weather. It's been great. I live in Washington, D.C., so actually I can't complain about this weather. Let me know if you can't hear me. I'll try to speak into the microphone. In the spring of 1776, Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband, John, who was working on a revolution that would create a new nation and eventually change the world. Thinking ahead to the drafting of laws, Abigail beseeched John to, quote, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. She continued, do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands, which she capitalized. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. This is Abigail now, not me. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, she said, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Well, you know how that went. The U.S. Constitution, written 11 years after Abigail's missive, made no mention of the ladies. Indeed, it would be another 133 years before women would garner the right to vote. During that time, women were, of course, bound by laws enacted by men, tyrannical or not, and they did not foment a rebellion. To the extent the suffragists protested, marched, and even spent time in jail, they did so not to overthrow the government, but to have a say in it. Today, women not only vote, but hold public office. Let's take a look at how equal that is. There currently are 12 female governors, 25 female U.S. senators, and 126 female members of the U.S. House of Representatives, according to a count by the Center for American Women and Politics at Rutgers University. Not my numbers, theirs. If you do the math, as I did, the first two numbers, female governors and senators, represent about 25% of the total, and the last, female House members, constitutes 29%. There are 2,424 women in state legislatures throughout the U.S., which sounds like a lot, doesn't it? But they're just 1/3 of the total. There are also 12 female attorneys general, 12 female secretaries of state, 7 female state treasurers, and 1 female insurance commissioner in all the states. What is women's best statistics? Well, we comprise 100% of the current vice presidents. On the other hand, Kamala Harris is the 49th vice president, so she represents 2% of all the people who have served in that office. And you don't have to be good at math to determine the percentage of US presidents who have been women. We're batting 0 for 46 in 235 years. Women also have little agency when it comes to the world of work. We earn 84 cents for every dollar a man earns, and women of color earn significantly less than women as a whole. Latinas earn just 55 cents for every dollar a non-Hispanic white male makes. The rate of change is moving slowly. When Congress passed the Equal Pay Act in 1963, women who worked full-time earned 59 cents for every dollar a man made. In 60 years, women's pay has increased less than half a cent on the man's dollar per year. That half a cent sounds insignificant, but consider this. Economists estimate that over the course of a career, during roughly the same period I have been a journalist, a woman working full-time has earned between $700,000 and $2 million less than a man with the same level of education. The greatest gap is between women with graduate degrees and their male counterparts. And while women have gained ground in corporate offices, only 7% of Fortune 500 companies are run by women. Now, 2 questions come to mind. First, do women have power anywhere? And second, setting aside pay disparities, why does it matter if women are in the White House or the governor's mansion or in the halls of Congress or even in the newsroom? Let's go in order. Do women have power anywhere? Certainly, we still rule the roost, so to speak. We take care of our houses and our families, making decisions about buying everything from groceries to furniture and kitchen appliances, and that's reflected in TV ads. Women, in general, also make most decisions about their children. We take our kids to doctor's appointments, join PTA boards, sign them up for summer camp, and memorize their schedules and their friends' names. Earlier this year, there was even a TikTok video poking fun at dads who couldn't name their children's closest friends. More to the point, though, women have a great deal of power, more than men, in a place you might not expect, the voting booth. In terms of public life, that might be the place where we flex our muscles the most. President Biden nodded to that fact in his State of the Union address earlier this month. Addressing the Supreme Court justices who were sitting right in front of him, he pointed out that when they ruled to overturn Roe v. Wade, the majority wrote, quote, "Women are not without electoral or political power." Forcefully, Biden added, "You're about to realize just how much you got that right." Clearly, he said, clearly, this is his speech, those bragging about overturning Roe v. Wade have no clue about the power of women. But they found out when reproductive freedom was on the ballot. We won in 2022 and 2023, and we will win again in 2024. Now, my crystal ball is a little cloudy regarding the November election, but I've spent a lot of time reporting on presidential campaigns the past 3 decades, and it's clear that the president is right about the potential of women's electoral power. Women have long voted in greater numbers than men for one big reason. There are more of us, and we live longer. Starting in 1980, when Ronald Reagan won the White House, women also have voted in greater proportions than men in presidential elections. It was also in 1980 that political scientists first noticed a gender gap in how people voted. For instance, in 1984, 62% of men voted for Reagan, while 56% of women did. That amounted to a gap of 6 points. Still, majorities of both men and women supported the Gipper, and he cruised to a landslide victory. So, there are more women in the US, and we vote in greater proportions than men. And yet, throughout most of women's voting history, that made no difference at all, until Bill Clinton. Clinton knocked the first President Bush out of the White House in 1992 with the support of both men and women. In neither case was it a majority because third-party candidate Ross Perot siphoned off a significant chunk of the vote. But Clinton won a plurality of both men's and women's votes. From 1920, when women won the right to vote, through that election in 1992, a majority of women and men usually voted the same way. In other words, if most men supported one candidate, most women did too. Some suggest that's because women voted as their husbands told them to. Not my favorite theory. Perhaps it was the other way around. It also could be that women and men voted similarly because there were fewer sources of information than there are now. Who didn't watch Walter Cronkite, Huntley and Brinkley, Peter Jennings, or Tom Brokaw? Who didn't read a local newspaper? Throughout most of our history, Americans were digesting pretty much the same facts, and the majority often came to the same conclusions. These facts, news, was almost always reported by men, white men, and I will get back to that. In 1996, though, something changed. Women rallied behind Clinton in a big way, giving him a strong majority, 55% of their vote, compared to 38% for Bob Dole. Women voted for Clinton, a known philanderer, because of the issues he championed: abortion rights, family leave, childhood immunizations, education, preventing domestic violence, and of course, kitchen table economic issues. He talked about his administration's efforts to fight breast cancer and to give loans to women-owned businesses. He appealed directly to so-called soccer moms, and they responded. For the first time, women were responsible for electing a president. If it had been up to men, we would have had a President Dole. Excuse me. That year marked the beginning of an important metamorphosis in political power. Ever since 1996, the majority of women has voted for the Democratic presidential candidate. Every single time. Al Gore, check. John Kerry, check. Barack Obama, check, check. Hillary Clinton, check. Joe Biden, check. Men are a little less consistent, but tend to lean Republican. In the past 30 years, men have voted for Republican presidential candidates all but one time. In 2008, they voted for Barack Obama by 1 percentage point. Compare that to women, who since 1996 have voted for the winner of the popular vote all but once. That was in 2004, when they supported John Kerry, a Democrat, but not by enough to help him defeat men's much stronger support for George W. Bush's reelection. But you might ask, what about Al Gore and Hillary Clinton? If the majority of women voted for them, why didn't they become president? And I'll bet you know, the Electoral College. While 54% of women voted for both Gore in 2000 and Hillary Clinton in 2016, and while each of the Democrats won the popular vote, they didn't carry enough states to rack up the needed 270 electoral votes. As I'm sure you know, we don't really have national elections in this country. We have 50 state elections, and one in the District of Columbia, where I live, each of which has representation in the 538-member Electoral College. A candidate must have 270 votes, just more than half, to win. The existence of the Electoral College also explains why polls have appeared to be wrong in some elections. They polled the national vote, not the state-by-state tally. In Gore's case, of course, the Supreme Court also weighed in, following weeks of painful vote counting nearby in Tallahassee. The fact that we don't have a national election in which every vote counts equally also explains why presidential candidates campaign almost exclusively in a handful of swing states. These are the states that appear to be up for grabs. Florida used to be a swing state, but it has become redder and redder in recent years. So you're unlikely to see either presidential candidate campaigning here much in 2024, even though Donald Trump lives in Palm Beach. This year, the battleground states include a few in the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and 3 in the South and Sun Belt, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. You can assume Joe Biden and Donald Trump will be spending the bulk of their time campaigning in those 6 states, with occasional stops in 2 other potential toss-up states, New Hampshire and North Carolina. And you can be sure Biden in particular will be working to shore up his support among women. If he doesn't, he's, as they say, toast. Because as you heard, Democrats need women to win. Now to my second question. Why does any of this matter? It's not quite like the old book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, but they do have different priorities. Women in elected office govern differently than men do. They collaborate more, even across the aisle. They work for policies that support women and children and that address health, education, and poverty. It is because of female Congress members that women get free mammograms, for example. They also have pushed to include women in clinical trials to address sexual harassment in the military and to provide child care assistance to needy families. People often ask me what constitutes a woman's issue. Every issue is a woman's issue. The economy certainly is an issue that women care about. So is immigration. So is safety and national security. Men care a lot about those issues too, but there are some issues that women care more about than men do, including healthcare, childcare, the social safety net, and the environment. This is true for women office holders as well as for women voters. And as you undoubtedly know, there are issues that affect women far more than they affect men. And you know the big one this year, abortion rights. For a long time, essentially from when the Supreme Court handed down Roe v. Wade in 1973 until it reversed course in 2022, the people who based their votes on abortion were by and large opposed to Roe v. Wade. Pro-life leaders got to work right away and smartly built a strong political movement that helped elect some like-minded presidents, starting with Reagan, but also including George W. Bush and Donald Trump. President Trump was an interesting case because he had in the past supported abortion rights, but that's not a winning message in the Republican Party. Trump appealed to evangelical leaders and others who oppose abortion rights, and with the help of Mike Pence, he pledged to nominate Supreme Court justices who would overturn Roe. After the court did that, the tables turned. Many women and some men were angry, furious, and not just in blue Democratic-leaning states. They flooded the polls, voting in record numbers in the midterm elections in the fall of 2022, preventing what had been predicted to be a red wave or a huge Republican onslaught in Congress. They also have defeated every attempt to codify abortion restrictions on state ballots and passed every measure that protected abortion rights, even in conservative states like Kansas. So here we are in 2024, and one big question that could determine the outcome of the election is how big abortion will loom. Will women and other abortion rights supporters put that issue at the top of their list and vote to support Joe Biden and Democrats running for Congress and state houses? Will abortion opponents do the same and rally around Trump and other Republicans? Or will one or both sides vote based on other issues entirely, the economy possibly, or Gaza? What about Biden's age or Trump's legal troubles? Again, my crystal ball is hazy. In 2022, nearly 10 million more women voted than men, and they voted largely for Biden. A lot has changed since then, and I would suggest it's far too early to prognosticate. Before I close, I'd like to get back to a comment I made earlier about the news. As I said, in the days of yore, people consume news primarily on one of the 3 network television stations or in newspapers and magazines. And by and large, it was reported by men. Although most news organizations still are run by and dominated by men, mostly white men, women and people of color have made significant inroads. What difference does that make? Just as female voters and office holders are more concerned than men about certain issues, female journalists, like journalists of color, bring their lived experiences to the job of news reporting. That explains why there's more coverage now of health care, child care, education, and reproductive rights. Than there has been in the past, sorry. We view life through a different prism, and our coverage, coupled with that of men, gives a fuller picture of the news. This is the value of women journalists, women office holders, women voters. This doesn't mean women only cover issues like the ones I mentioned. For most of my career, I've reported stories that used to be in the purview of men, from police and courts to public housing, City Hall, the State House, the White House, and Congress. But often, while my male colleagues and competitors were focused on the men running these entities, as was I also talked to the women who worked for the men at the top. And guess what? They knew a lot. And I got a lot of scoops from them. But often, when I proposed stories about issues particularly concerning women, my male editors didn't understand. I had to fight repeatedly to write about inequality, for instance, or get this, the possibility that the Supreme Court would overturn abortion rights. Now I work for the Fuller Project, which reports exclusively on women and injustice around the world. We produce stories that larger mainstream organizations ignore, and then we give them to those organizations so they'll run them, because the need is still there. So for instance, as you heard, I recently had a story that ran in the New Republic, yesterday actually, about American foreign policies that affect women who would like to get abortions in other countries. The US has two policies in particular, the Helms Amendment and the Mexico City policy, that are touted to reduce abortions, but actually research shows that they drive up the numbers. So when foreign countries accept, and foreign organizations accept US foreign assistance, they have to abide by the rules that are tied to that assistance. Since 1973, after Roe v. Wade, there has been an amendment called the Helms Amendment that's been tied to all family planning assistance, and it says that if you take U.S. family planning assistance, you cannot perform abortion, you cannot counsel on abortion, and you cannot refer anyone to an abortion. So that's been in effect for a little more than 50 years. Ronald Reagan, in 1984, came up with a new policy called the Mexico City policy, which was announced at a population conference in Mexico. Under that policy, which has been invoked by every Republican president and revoked by every Democratic president since 1984, not only can organizations that counsel, perform, or refer on abortion, they cannot take U.S. money if they do those things. They also cannot use any other money to do those things. So they can't use U.S. money to perform, counsel, or refer on abortions, but they also can't use money that they get from other countries or even money that they raise in their own country to do those same things. Under President Trump, that policy was expanded exponentially to include all health care money. The other Republican presidents had only included family planning money. So now it affected under Trump $12 billion worth of foreign assistance and included money that went for things like HIV/AIDS, cancer screening, malaria, and tuberculosis. The result of all of that, of these two policies, is that in the 4 years that Trump was president, according to the National Academy of Sciences, 108,000 women died and 360,000 additional cases of HIV/AIDS occurred. There was also more malaria and tuberculosis. There's now a plan called Project 2025, written by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative, very powerful foundation based in Washington. That is, they would like it to be a roadmap for any new Republican president, starting with Trump if he wins, that would expand that policy even further to include all foreign assistance, not just healthcare foreign assistance. So we don't know what the impact of that would be, but people are very worried. People in other countries are very worried about that. Anyway, you can read more details about this in the New Republic or on the Fuller Project's website, which is fullerproject.org. The New Republic is tnr.com. It's been 248 years since Abigail Adams advised her husband to remember the ladies. Women contribute enormously to this country, whether they work in homes, in an office, in a state capitol, or the national one. Still, it's clear that full equality in all arenas will take a bit longer. I hope it's less than 248 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jodi. Great presentation.
Thank you.
My name is Paula Seymour, and I've been a professor here at Flagler for 25 years. I teach in the School of Business Administration. Hey, Liz. And I'm the director of our social entrepreneurship program here on campus. I have a background. Excuse me. I am a Flagler alumna, so I graduated from Flagler with a degree in business administration, ventured into my first master's degree of international business, then ventured into another master's degree of women, gender, spirituality, and social justice, and just completed my PhD in religion with a concentration in women's spirituality. So a lot of what Jodi has been speaking about and a lot of what her work is really dear and close to my heart. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Skylar Stoffel. I am a junior here at Flagler, and I am one of Dr. Seymour's social entrepreneurship students. That is my major, and my concentration within that is community health. So we cover a bunch of topics such as public health, wellness, nutrition, health sciences in general. And then my minor is computer information systems. And as of right now, I'm also a board member at Compassionate St. Augustine here locally, and a board member of the Charter for Compassion International as well. So again, also aligned with a lot of the women's rights work that we have here today that's being talked about. So awesome.
Love to. Thank you. Jodi, I was on the Fuller Project website, and I read a great article of yours, The Global Cost of the American Anti-Abortion Movement, which illuminates the profound impact of the U.S. anti-abortion policies on women's health globally, particularly in developing countries. How do you navigate the complexities of reporting on such a polarizing issue, ensuring the human stories of affected women are front and center, while dissecting broader geopolitical and policy-driven implications?
Well, that was a big question that I'm sure I'll forget parts of, so you might have to remind me. So in terms of this story, first of all, I worked for months on this story. I also edit stories, so I have to juggle my work. But I spent an awful lot of time researching, reading many studies that have been done. Many of them are academic studies, peer-reviewed studies, and some of them are studies that have been done by think tanks around the country. And not only in the U.S., there have been studies also done in other countries, particularly in the UK. And so I spent a lot of time digesting these studies. You're familiar with academic writing. It maybe takes me a little longer to go through it. And then I would contact the people who wrote them if I was able to find them. And I spent a lot of time interviewing the authors of these studies so that I could make sure that I understood what they were talking about. And then I started reaching out to advocates, people who have been working to try to make changes in these policies, as well as supporters of the policies. Supporters of the policies were less eager to talk to me, and I talk about that in the story. Advocates were very eager to talk, in this country in particular. What was more difficult was finding women in, I reached out to women in a couple of countries in Africa to try to find out really what was going on there. The difficulty is that, in particular, I was talking to women in Kenya and Nigeria. Abortion is largely illegal there with very few exceptions. So women are reticent to talk about not only their experiences if they've had abortions, but also if they work in a clinic or if they advocate for abortion rights. They don't necessarily want their name published or even the names of their organizations because they're worried about repercussions. It took some time, but I finally was able to, through several people, to track down a woman who I interviewed who told me her story about having an unsafe abortion in Kenya. This was a woman who had been gang raped by 3 men when she was 16 years old. She was in high school, and she got pregnant as a result of that. And she grew up in a large slum in Nairobi and didn't have any money, so she could not afford a legal abortion, which she probably wouldn't have been able to get anyway. Rape is an exception in Kenya. However, it is rarely enforced. It has to be signed off by doctors, and women usually don't go to the doctors for that. So her option was either to carry the baby to term or to get an abortion. She did not want to have a baby at 16. So she contacted one friend. She did not tell her parents. She did not go to a hospital. She did not go to the police. She contacted one friend, and together they scoured the streets and found a woman who agreed to perform the abortion in her home. She was untrained. She stuck needles up into the woman, the girl, really. She was 16. It was very painful, and that was it. So that was her story. She went on later in life to get married. She now has 2 daughters, and she does not want her daughters or anybody else's to go through the kind of experience that she had. So she now advocates for women and girls, not only on abortion rights, but on other things too, like domestic violence concerns and that kind of thing. So I decided, because her story was very vivid, I decided to start the story by telling her story. Her name is Editar. I told her story and then moved on, kind of broadening out to the larger issues. And you had another complicated question for me there, which I'm probably avoiding.
I think you pretty much.
Oh, okay, great. I would have loved to have gone to Kenya to talk to her, but we're a small nonprofit, and funds are an issue. So instead, I reached out to her first on WhatsApp. On the phone, on my phone, on an app, I reached her, and we set up a time to talk on the phone and on Zoom, and but we talked more than once. We talked for probably about an hour and a half the first time, and then I would go back and check things with her and make sure she understood that I of course asked. The very first thing I asked her, was it okay to record the conversation? She said yes, and I asked, of course, if I could use her name because that is such a sensitive issue. She said yes. I checked back with her repeatedly on details about using her name and about reporting some of the very sensitive issues that she talked about. She did not want me to go into details about the rape other than to say that she was lured into an abandoned house near the river, the Nairobi River, and that the 3 people who raped her were people she knew, one of whom she grew up with, and he was like a brother to her.
I'm changing the subject a little bit, but I know that you touched on gender equality that you've seen specifically within your career and also generally. And as a woman myself who's hoping to break into a male-dominated industry, 2 industries actually, kind of the convergence of business and technology, what would be your general advice to all women on how we can advocate for ourselves within our careers?
You just have to keep pushing. Do not give up. They might, things are definitely better now than they were, and things were better for me than for the women who went before me, and I stand on their shoulders. But there will be roadblocks, there always are roadblocks, and you just have to keep pushing. Don't give up. When I got my first job, I worked in St. Louis. I was one of 5 women on the city desk, and there were a lot of men. And the editors kept coming to me and saying, how about covering a parade? And I was like, I don't want to cover parades. I want to send me to a murder. Send me to anywhere except covering a parade. I said I would cover the parades if they were rotated from reporter to reporter. I would cover my share of them, but I was not a journalist to cover parades. There's nothing wrong with covering parades, as my husband back in the back will tell you, because he's covered many of them.
As a person who spent half of his professional life as an editor, this is very uncomfortable.
So I just pushed back. When I was in St. Louis and when the Cardinals baseball team went to Atlanta to play in the National League Conference game, I happened to be walking by the city editor when he said, I need to find somebody to send down there to interview people. And I said, I'll go. And they were shocked. His jaw dropped. They were looking for a man. And guess what? They sent me. So, it worked out.
Breaking through the glass ceiling. Thank you, Jodi. In your role with the Fuller Project, you focus on the effects of U.S. policies on women and girls, both domestically and internationally. From your extensive reporting, what are some key lessons or strategies from other countries that you believe the U.S. could learn from or adapt to improve women's rights and gender equality?
Well, we certainly could break through that glass ceiling. In some other countries, they have had women at the top of the power chart. There have been women heads of state in a number of countries, and it's a little bit shocking to me that we're so far behind on that, because it's not even a new thing, right? And I'm not talking about a Democratic woman or a Republican woman, just a woman, There are many good women out there who could, I think, run the country at least as well as the men have. So I think that's the first lesson that we can learn from other countries. And other than that, I think we really have to look at our numbers in terms of pay equity. It's about time that women earn the same amount that men earn for the same job. Women have the same amount of education. There are more women in universities now than men. There are more women in law schools than men. So what's the problem here? It seems a little bit ridiculous. In journalism, we have the same problem. We don't have enough women who are running news organizations. And so I think that, there are so many lessons to be learned, but it's kind of unfathomable that women who do the same job, have the same experience, the same level of education or more, are paid less, are not promoted at the same rate, and are not put in charge at the same rate as men.
Well said. Thank you.
I think a couple comments kind of in your response to that question. I think as a woman right now who is developing her portfolio and resume and trying to put her foot out into the workforce currently, I've noticed this feeling of not being enough. And I think that I feel like even kind of in comparison to some of the male counterparts who may be applying for the same job, I feel like I'm trying to prove myself more. And I think it's definitely something that I would love to see even out eventually, because I could be putting in 10 times more the amount of work than some people who are my peers, and I still feel like I'm not getting the same amount of response. But yeah, and additionally, after spending some time in Tanzania in January, and I learned that their president is a Muslim woman. And I just thought that that was something that was so shocking. And then coming back to America and thinking, we are just so far behind. So that was definitely a huge thing. But for my question, I was wanting to ask you, considering the current global and national landscape, what do you see as the emerging challenges to women's rights? And how might these challenges shape the future of activism and policymaking? And additionally, really, what is a journalist in the media's role in addressing these challenges and fostering a more inclusive society?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm sure that you are at least as qualified as the men who are applying for the same jobs as you. And when I started, the general saying was that women had to work twice as hard to earn half as much. I hope that changes, and I know it's changed a little bit, not enough, but don't ever listen to anyone who tells you you're not as qualified as a man. Just as an aside, when I one time asked for a raise, a friend of mine said, "Go into that room and pretend you're this guy." And I did. And my boss, the editor, acted as if he were hurt that I was asking for a raise. It's like, I thought we were friends. I'm like, you don't write my paychecks from your own personal bank account, so come on, give me a break. What needs to happen? I think that we need to have male friends who help. We need to have coalitions of people who actually get out there and help. And I think a lot of that starts in the polling place. I think that more women need to run for office to show what we can do. And again, it should be in both parties. I think more women and men need to vote for women because, again, women have different priorities, some different priorities than men. They usually have the same priorities and more, right? So they're not going to let the economy slide. They're not going to ignore the military, but they're going to pay more attention to some issues, things like health care. Things like child care, which would help more women advance in the workplace because a lot of women don't have the time, can't afford to hire somebody or put their children in daycare. Single women, it's even harder, parents. So I think that we really need people to wake up, and it doesn't matter if you're liberal or conservative. But I think we all know that women can do the job. We've seen it in all kinds of places, and places like Tanzania, they managed to do it, so why can't we?
Now to the audience. This is our first question. I'm a huge Margaret Fuller fan. I so appreciate the Fuller Project's name in her honor, and the project's carrying out her work, and then some. How about a shout out for her to those here tonight who have never heard of her before?
Sure. Well, Margaret Fuller was an international correspondent in the early 20th century. And she, her name is not well known. There is a biography of her. I can't remember the name of the author, but it's not hard to find. And we have information on our website about Margaret Fuller. And, a shout out to the women like her, Nellie Bly, other women who really paved the way There were many women who came before me who really had to fight. I knew some of the women who covered the White House before I did, and they were mostly relegated to covering the first ladies. And so that changed a little bit before I got there, but not that long before I got there. Oh, yes, that's right. That's right. Brooke Kroger, yes, that is the author. Thank you.
In light of Trump's transgressions against women, why do you suppose so many women support him?
I spent some time in 2019 and 2020 researching that very question. I went to 2 counties in northeastern Pennsylvania, which had been Democratic counties until Trump came along. These are Lackawanna and Lucerne counties, where Scranton and Wilkes-Barre are, the area that Joe Biden was born, and Hillary Clinton's father was born. And they had been Democratic, largely Catholic. Most of the people there became Democratic when John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, and they had voted Democratic all the way through Obama. It's a largely white, but like 89–90% white area, very working class, and in 2016, Lackawanna County, which is where Wilkes-Barre is, voted for the Republican for the first time in decades, and Luzerne County voted for Hillary Clinton, but only by a smidgen, and that was because of the city of Scranton. But in the past, they had voted in much higher percentages for Democrats. That alone swung the election for Trump. Those 2 counties made the difference in Pennsylvania, and it was Pennsylvania that swung the election for Trump. If those 2 counties had voted the way they had in the past, Hillary Clinton would have won. So why? Why did they vote? I did not forget that part of the question. I know, you would. So what the women told me, and I spoke largely to white women who did not go to college, because that makes up the majority, and those are the women who are, of all women, that's the group of women who support Trump the most. Not exclusively, but the most. And when I asked them why they supported him, they basically said, they said, he speaks our language. He speaks to me. I identify with him. He understands me. So it usually wasn't an issue in particular, but it was his demeanor, which is interesting, right? Because his demeanor puts off a lot of women too. But in this case, they saw something in him and really identified with that. They liked the way he talked to people who, are latte sipping, Starbucks going, professorial types like Obama. And they could identify with kind of the way he spoke to people without a filter. They liked that a lot. The one issue that they brought up pretty often was immigration. They liked what he said about immigration. There aren't a lot of immigrants in those 2 counties. There's one tiny little pocket in Lackawanna County of Latino immigrants from the Dominican Republic mostly, although a lot of them are also from Puerto Rico, so that makes them American. But there aren't a lot of immigrants there. But nevertheless, that issue was one that spoke to them.
The 2 questions that are related. One asks backsliding. What needs to change to increase the number of female politicians?
A lot of people are working on that. There are a number of organizations that work to train women. to run for office if they're interested and to recruit women. It's a complicated issue, and I think some of it goes to what Skylar was saying. You have to have a high level of confidence to run for office. You have to be able to put up with all kinds of stuff. You have to put up with reporters looking into your background. You have to put up with voters who are throwing all kinds of accusations at you. You have to work 24/7. You have to raise money, which is very difficult for a lot of women to do. And I think part of it has to do with just building the confidence of people, finding people who might be interested in running, and teaching girls that this is a career path that could be open to them. So, we really need to start young, teaching our girls that they can do anything, right? They can be in science, they can be in math, they can do anything they want. If they choose to work from home, they can work from home, right? It's an option. But I think that we need to tell our daughters that if they care to go into politics, that is a field that's open to them as well. And then when they do, we need to give money to them in the same proportion that we give it to men. So Democrats have been a little bit better than this at this than Republicans, although there are a lot of Republican women in office too, but Democrats have an organization called Emily's List, which helps raise money for women who support abortion rights to run for office on every level. And they raise an enormous amount of money, and they also do training for women. So how to run for office. Women, it doesn't necessarily come naturally to anyone, right? How to run for office is a different skill set. So they help train them. And there are other organizations that do that kind of thing as well.
Globally again. Today in The Guardian, one of the headline news or articles was talking about Gambian Parliament debate bill to reverse the ban on female genital mutilation. In light of recent discussions around this topic in Gambia and the ongoing debate over abortion rights in the U.S., how do you see these issues as reflective of the broader challenges to women's bodily autonomy worldwide?
That is a big question. If I could solve that problem, I wouldn't be sitting here. I would be maybe president, right? That's such a tough issue, and female genital mutilation still happens in a lot of countries, even in countries where it's illegal. And when I talked to women in Kenya and Nigeria, they also talked about that problem. So, Gambia is one place, but it's in a lot of countries around the world, and I think we'd be surprised probably at how often that happens. And I think that the culture really needs to change in a lot of places. It's partially political, but it's partially the culture, and some of it goes to local religions. I don't like to interfere in other people's religions, but I think education is also important, and working to empower the women themselves, because they need to learn how to speak up on their own behalf. And that's a very hard thing to do if you have, a big culture that has practiced that for generations, and you're the one who wants to break out of it. So women need to learn, and young girls, again, need to learn what the truth is in terms of female genital mutilation, what it does, what the impact will be on their bodies. Just like, girls and women here need to understand the facts about some of the things that go on. I've talked to young women here sometimes who think that if they take birth control, then later, if they want to have babies, they either won't be able to, or their babies will have health problems. So we know that that's not true, but they need to learn that. And so I think the same issue is in other countries as well.
So what are some of the strategies that you use to ensure that your reporting is respectful of a diversity of opinions and beliefs while also advocating for women's rights and bodily autonomy?
Well, like I said, we good journalists, and there are many, go out and seek all the opinions, as many opinions as they can on whatever the topic is. So, I mean, first of all, when I decide even what I'm going to write about, I've already talked to a lot of people and tried to get a diversity of opinion. One thing that I've always done is try to make sure to talk to people who come from different backgrounds, people who are young, people who are old, people who are women, people who are men, people who are non-binary, people who come from different parts of the country, and of course people of color, and people who have maybe are immigrants, people who have different levels of education, all the things, right? So I think it's important that we as journalists reflect the population. And the only way to do that is to go out and talk to people. One of the problems that I have, honestly, with a lot of journalists in Washington is that they don't do that. I grew up in Peoria, Illinois, which is really a crossroads and a cross-section, has a broad cross-section in its population, and in some ways is about as far as from Washington as you can get. So, my father has passed away, but what I used to do when he was alive was I would call him, well, I called him all the time anyway, but one of the things I did was ask him what he was hearing. What are people talking about? When you go for coffee in the morning, what are you hearing from other people there? And what are you hearing from your friends and from others? What are you reading in the newspaper? Just to get an idea of that. I do the same thing now by talking to people across the country, or if I talk to people in other countries, trying to get a sense of a broad cross-section. That doesn't change, you were talking about making sure that women have bodily autonomy. Well, that's not my decision. My job is to tell the truth, is to try to cull as much information as I can and present all the information that's accurate, and then to let my readers decide for themselves. And then the chips fall where they may. And that's what I do when I cover politics, when I write about candidates, and when I write about health issues or anything else.
I want to thank the professor for saving me. There was a question that I misunderstood from the audience that raised the question about Gambia. And the professor saved me, and she asked your question, so thank you very much. Good. That's for sure. Last question then is, when you face the new political journalism students at Cornell, what do you cover in your first lecture?
I ask them what news is. And it's interesting to hear, because the students are actually not, Cornell doesn't have a journalism school, so these are not students who have learned much about journalism before they come to me. And I've had a couple who have had a little bit of journalism experience, writing for the school paper, for instance, and one of them actually had an internship in Washington as a reporter, but mostly they don't. So I need to talk to them about what news is. I talk to them about why it's important that we cover the news and why we do it accurately. I talk about journalism ethics. And I try to get a sense of where they're coming from. In the first class, I just try to learn more about them so that I kind of have a sense of where my starting point is. And I try to well, the first assignment that I've had them do is to write a profile of another classmate, which serves two purposes. And this was an idea that I borrowed from my husband. But I have them write about each other so that I can read about each of them, and I can get a sense of how they write. And I try to talk to them about accuracy, and more accuracy, double checking, triple checking, because the worst thing we can do as journalists is to get things wrong. You know when you read something, if it's wrong, you don't believe anything else in the article, right? I don't. So that's kind of the first order of business.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for coming. Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Professor in particular, and Skylar especially, for your questions too. It's been a very, very interesting night. As you know, this is the vernal equinox, where there's equal hours of daylight, equal hours of darkness. Thank you, Jodi, and for tipping the balance. Oh, it's been a wonderful presentation. Jodi addressed students during the day. We had a spirited lunch with more students. It was just a terrific, terrific day. And in appreciation and thanks, we have the famous statue of Henry Flagler to give to her. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next month. Thanks.